So welcome everybody to the second episode of a three-part series on how the world can feed itself while dealing with multiple challenges, from climate change and the loss of precious plants and animal life to ensuring farmers and rural communities have sustainable lives and livelihoods. The focus of this series, ReAgriculture, Food and Farming on a Healthy Planet, is showcasing and inspiring the world to get behind regenerative agriculture, perhaps as a crucial key to unlock new opportunities. This second episode will try to look at what the blockers are for widespread uptake of regenerative agriculture. Are they finance? Are they education of farmers? Are they policy? Are they more? And we want to look at how to break through these blockers, how to fast forward a better future for food and agriculture that addresses multiple crises and delivers multiple benefits quickly, because remember, we don't have time. According to a recent report, which I read in the Financial Times, just 15% of agricultural lands are broadly regenerative in the world. We need to step this up. And we need to do this at speed, and we need to do it at scale, given that food production is something around a quarter or more of the pollution that is causing climate change. Let me ask our viewers to download the We Don't Have Time app here at wedon'thavetime.org, where you can interact with our guests and you can pose questions. We're delighted to have with us 4 terrific guests to join us in a few minutes. But before I do that, let me please bring in and let me introduce my wonderful co-moderator, which is Hanneke Faber. Hanneke is President Nutrition and leads Unilever's Nutrition Business Group. It's a $12 billion business, I understand. You're in 150 countries. That's almost the whole world. And you're known for iconic global brands such as Knorr and Hellmann's, emerging brands like The Vegetarian Butcher and Marley, is that right? I don't know. As well as local brand leaders like Horlicks in India, Bango soy sauce in Indonesia, and Calvi peanut butter, and you know my favorite too, Marmite. Above all, she is a passionate advocate about positive systems change in food and agriculture through the lens of regenerative agriculture. Briefly, Hanneke, can you tell the audience what you've been up to here at COP27? Was there something that you saw or heard and you went, wow, that's really new, that's really exciting, that's something I can think about?
Yeah, no, thanks, Nick, and it's great to be here, right here in Egypt today. What have I been up to at COP? I think Elvis said it, a little less conversation and a little more action. So that's what we've been trying to do here at COP, raise our own ambitions as Unilever, but also raise the ambitions of the private sector and raise the ambitions of government, because we don't have time. And the one thing I have learned, and that actually makes me really, really hopeful, is that for the first time ever, food was on the agenda here at COP, and it's COP27, right? Because markets, countries have realized that we cannot get to net zero if we do not address the agricultural system that produces all the food we eat. So we're going to talk about regenerative agriculture today, and I'm super excited about that. That's what we've been talking about today at COP all day.
Fantastic. Hanneke, please stay with us. So now let's hear from our guests. We want to hear about their work, and in the second half, we're going to dig a little deeper into the blockers and how to remove them to scale regenerative agriculture. First, we want to hear from a young farmer, a celebrity chef, you can say, who's also working in communities in the Philippines. And that led her to be named a Forbes Under 30 on the 30 list in 2020. She's a Young Champion of the Earth 2019 for the United Nations Environment Programme. And she's called Louise Mabulo. She's founder of the Cacao Project. Louise, are you with us here somewhere? Yes, through the magic of Zoom. Hanneke, why don't you come just a little bit towards, me on this side. That's perfect. Hi, Louise.
Hi, Nick. Good to see you.
What time is it in the Philippines right now?
Well, it's currently 1 in the morning in the Philippines.
Oh my God, it's 1 in the morning. Heavens above. Well, thank you so much for being with us. Look, Louise, briefly, can you tell us about your work on sustainable farming, regenerative agriculture? What is the Cacao Project? Fire away.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. So I work on the Cacao Project in the Philippines, which is an initiative working with farmers at the grassroots level to transform their farms and their livelihoods into something that's more resilient. We're building agroforests and helping them diversify their existing crops from coconut monocultures into cocoa farms, along with bananas and all these different assortments and diversities of crops. Not just that, we work under 3 branches, which is agriculture, education, and regeneration, training farmers with the skills and know-how they need to be able to transition into a time where our climate is constantly adapting and changing. At the moment, we're working in San Fernando in the Philippines. We've worked with over 200 farmers, plant over 100,000 trees, over 100 hectares of land. And we're still working to expand and grow this to be more inclusive to other farmers, as well as make sure that they have a lot of options on their plate and how they can diversify livelihoods, but also understand the whole value chain of our food systems.
And what does regenerative agriculture mean to you?
Well, for us, regenerative agriculture essentially means a holistic way for us to be able to steward our land and work with nature, to be able to produce food in the way that nature intended, while also producing green, economic, and sustainable livelihoods for farmers and locals here. But on top of that, regenerative agriculture is also a tool for us to be able to transition into resiliency. The Philippines is one of the most vulnerable countries to hazards brought about by climate change, and farmers and producers are some of the most vulnerable groups. So it's really a way to enable them to slowly adapt to our changing climate and be able to better prepare for it.
That's amazing, Louise. So excited to hear. And I think we have to talk offline a little more. We're looking to do more coconut farming in the Philippines regeneratively as Unilever. So we'll pick that up offline. But so excited about what
Absolutely.
you're doing. Yeah. Now, I heard you are also a finalist in Junior Master Chef.
Yes.
Is that right? Congratulations.
That's right. Thank you.
Congratulations. Does that link at all to your regenerative agricultural efforts?
Absolutely. I was a finalist in Junior Master Chef at the age of 12. And while I'm 24 now, it launched me into a really early culinary career. I began cooking as soon as the show ended. So from the ages of 14 up to 18, I was doing professional culinary training. And slowly, as I was going through this whole process of doing pop-up dinners and creating menus, I realized just how food wasn't just something that was served on a table on a plate where people could enjoy it over a dinner. It wasn't just me as a chef curating these menus. It was something that extended far beyond us into farmers, into food systems and logistics and suppliers and marketing. And there was just so many factors that went in on it that I realized that I couldn't just be a chef. I had to address the whole issues beyond it, whether that was in scarcities in supply chains, food insecurity, why certain things were getting impacted, and even to the point of typhoons and resiliency. And that's how I slowly transitioned from just being a chef to farm to table cuisine, becoming a farmer myself. And inevitably, once we were experiencing the brunts of typhoons and realizing that farmers needed extra support, that's when I began the Cacao Project.
Super. So stay with us, Louise. I'll invite Hanneke to come round here. Stay with us. I hope you can see something of the studio. Now, I'd like to turn to Irene Ajoyuk. Is that not bad? Okay, super. I lived in Kenya for like 13 years. How can I get that wrong, Irene? But anyway, she's an environment and climate resilience specialist with over 10 years of experience working with communities in Kenya across different landscapes. She's working on a doctorate in ecology and natural resources at the Right Livelihood College, hosted at the Center for Development Research at the University of Bonn in Germany. And she's focusing on land degradation and farmer-managed natural regeneration. Irene is also an ambassador for the organization, the Evergreening Alliance. Irene, please come and join us on the chair over there. Remember to keep your microphone nice and tight to the mouth. And please tell us about your work on regenerative farming in East Africa. Is it happening? And is it important?
Yes, so regenerative agriculture is happening. It is very important, and I will give a specific case of farmer-managed natural regeneration, where farmers have been trained to intentionally identify the local indigenous trees on their farmlands and the stumps that exist, because FMNR is a principle of releasing the forest underground. So while the conventional model of introducing trees on the landscape is becoming challenging in the dry lands, FMNR, which is Farmer Managed Natural Regeneration, provides an opportunity for farmers to increase tree cover within their farms. And this is very crucial because regenerative agriculture relies on the soil health. Regenerative agriculture requires biodiversity that can actually deal with the challenges of pests and diseases, but also improve an enabling environment for crops to increase production and in a sustainable way. Regenerative agriculture also requires farmers to utilize their local knowledge and bring back that which has been lost. And when the previous speaker talked about food, I already thought about, our local food that we have moved away from and are trying to intensify or introduce more of the food types that were not indigenous to our places. And this is really pushing for intensified agriculture. So when you apply concepts like FMNR, you allow farmers to utilize the natural resources that they have, especially the local trees, to build on their food security, because then they can have access to the wild fruits, they can have access to fodder, which is important for their livestock, so that when there is serious drought, they don't have to, exploit the pasture, but they can harvest fodder from the trees and give their livestock, and their milk production increases, and they're able actually to ensure that they do not further degrade, because when the soils are bad, when the pasture is less, they intensify and go further to, destroy the environment.
Yeah, regenerative agriculture, soil health, and resilience are so closely linked. So I'm glad you said it. I had a totally different question for you, actually. So that's the farmers. They're using better practices. Have you guys done any work on how we tell consumers about, these ingredients, these products being regeneratively farmed? So consumers maybe know about organic or fair trade, but have you guys done any work on letting them know about how the products were farmed?
Awareness is going on the importance of eating clean food, okay? So clean food is organically produced. When you apply models like FMNR, you are actually on the pathway to organic farming, because sometimes it becomes very difficult to get a farmer who has never practiced organic farming to practice it with fidelity to the extent it can actually attract the prices in the market or get the labeling, So rarely do you find normal farmers able to participate in this space, especially in the market system or the value chain. But the farmers are now coming to a point where they're looking at their health and they also want to eat clean food. So they are the first consumers we reach out to. Beyond them, we are now creating awareness to the community to appreciate the need to eat clean food for their health. So then their products become marketable within their environment. What I would say is probably what the private sector needs to consider is a fair return on investment for these farmers. Because when they practice regenerative agriculture, their food products should actually attract fair prices compared to those that are not really done in the more safe way, in the more environmentally sensitive way, and more climate resilience. So our governments, our private sector should support these farmers to be able to tag their products in a manner that can actually enhance, scale up of what they're doing, so that at least their work is appreciated. But even more importantly, that the sustainable agriculture practices they do, in the end, address the climate crisis we are facing, and also ensures that we have a healthy generation of people.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very
Clean
much
food.
indeed. Yeah, and I think that's very interesting, because in a sense what you're talking about is you're growing up consumer awareness from the ground up, in a sense.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay, good point. Okay, now we've got to take a seat there, Irene, and you're going to hand over the microphone to Chris Buss, who's director of the IUCN Center for Economy and Finance. You might have to explain who IUCN is, because the audience out there is an eclectic audience of interested people, but they don't know all the acronyms. Chris, he's responsible for the overall program delivery of the economics, enterprise, and investment part of IUCN, which includes agriculture, with a portfolio of nearly what is it, 500 million US dollars in direct program funding. He's also part of Regen 10, which was a new initiative launched at COP26 in Glasgow last year. And this is about leveraging finance for regenerative agriculture, I understand, Chris. Chris, come and join one of these. I think we're going to pass the mic. The tech team is talking to me. We're going to pass the microphone around, gentlemen. Thank you. All right, you think that Chris should have Hanneke's microphone? She's very decent. She's willing to part with it. If it was my grandson, he'd be fighting me right now. But anyway, over to you, Chris.
Great. Well, yes, thanks. So, yes, the IUCN is the International Union for Conservation of Nature. And the big word there is union. We have over 1,400 members ranging from state governments through to NGOs, WWF, local NGOs, and then indigenous peoples groups and subnational governments. So a good range of stuff, a good range of organizations to influence change on nature and nature-based solutions and how we implement that, yes. So Nick, Regen 10, yes, as IUCN, we were part of the initial design of Regen 10, and it was launched at the World Leaders Summit last year. And with support of IKEA and Rockefeller Foundations, this year we've moved out to an inception phase. And really using COP27 as an opportunity to get stakeholder engagement, whether that be with multinational companies, whether that be with smallholder farmers, or whether that be with indigenous peoples groups who are central to the mission of transforming food systems, which is the heart of Regen 10. How do we transform the food systems? By building that knowledge, that understanding and accelerating action towards regenerative agriculture. But the central pillar behind it is inclusivity, making sure that it's a farmer-centric approach, working with local farmers, local stakeholders, indigenous peoples to not only build up that understanding, but ensure that culture, social, environmental, nature-based solutions and nature are central to regenerative systems. Right. And it's through a network of networks. So it's working with farmers, smallholders, indigenous peoples, but multinationals and wide range of international organizations that bring those skills to transfer us to regenerative agriculture.
But is there an aim to leverage $5, $5 billion, 500, 5,000? I mean, is there a goal on the horizon, or is that at the moment not there, but will be something thought about? How do you leverage money?
Yeah. I mean, the initial construct was to mobilize 100 million as technical support to drive the landscapes to transition, to build up the metrics and data and understanding of what regenerative agriculture looks like, and really mobilizing those resources to make it happen. Yeah.
Right. Okay, good. Hanneke.
Yeah, I love what you said about inclusivity, Chris. So how do we engage using Regen 10, not just the big farmers, but all those millions of smallholders?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking to my heart there, and I'm sat next to Irene, and I think, the transition to regenerative agriculture has to happen. It's got to happen. It will happen, whether it's regenerative agriculture, however we define it. Let's move on to action. Let's try and mobilize those billions that is needed. And we realize that small and large scale producers are important to the system, but what we want to drive in Regen 10 is making sure that also we want to pay specific attention to those smallholders. And I just because they present a massive opportunity and an underestimated opportunity. And just reading some statistics, you've got 500 million to 1 billion family farms. And they present 80% to produce 80% of the food in different regions. And those organizations are organized into structures. We call them forest and farm producer organizations. In Asia, for example, the Asia Farmers Association, they have 15 million farmers in 16 countries that they can access. And that's through 180,000 local organizations, cooperatives or businesses. The Eastern African Farmers Federation, 25 million in 10 countries. And a wide range of working with the Global Alliance for Territorial Communities who work in 24 countries with indigenous peoples groups and that's over 950 million hectares. So the real mobilizing mobilizing those organizations really needs two things. First of all, finance that is agile and responsive enough to create the conditions for mobilizing finance, so the capacity building of those organizations to transition to regenerative agriculture, to allow those organizations to be able to hold and disseminate finance, to actually mobilize large-scale finance. And we've seen examples of that. So the second thing is then that direct finance and I think, you know, we saw agile and mobile finance through COVID. Yeah, we got to small and local enterprises. We got a lot of finance that was mobilized. And we see examples of those, but I'm the next guest from Rabobank who will just laugh at the figures that I'm talking about of 80 million to indigenous peoples through the World Bank Forest Investment Program dedicated grant mechanism, which is mobilizing 80 million to local communities. And then also we had a great example from the Asia Farmers Association that they received 2 million. It's a small money, but they received 2 million and they passed that through to their members as COVID responses. And actually they mobilized it through direct loans, and they received 99% of that money back. And too often we hear it's a risky enterprise, and it shouldn't be.
Exactly. No, Chris, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into that afterwards. You touched on that. That's good. Now we go to Max. Okay, Max. Max Berkelmans. He's a consultant with Rabobank Acorn. You might have to explain what the difference is between Rabobank and Acorn. It's probably one and the same, but there's a special arm, I think, to it. And Max is working in this project, and Max is it's not just a bank, is it, Rabobank? It's a long history of financing agricultural production. Tell us what Acorn is doing in this area of regenerative agriculture and how it fits into maybe into the bank itself, into the global operation and all its arms and legs, if that's possible, in a brief couple of minutes. Quite easy, really.
No pressure there, Nick. Thank you.
No pressure.
And thanks for the introduction as well. So I want to zoom out a bit before I start my promotional talk about Acorn. Acorn is a department within Rabobank. And as you mentioned, Rabobank, we're a farmer cooperative bank. We have our roots in the food and agricultural sector, founded by farmers as well. So obviously, agriculture and working with farmers is very central to our mission of growing a better world together. And I'm glad you mentioned it, Chris, as well, is that I don't think anyone, and also ourselves, can really take that mission seriously if we don't consider smallholder farmers that are responsible for, well, I thought it was 70, but apparently it's 80% of the world food. So, and as Chris also mentioned, financing smallholder farmers traditionally has been considered as quite a risky investment. And to be frank, Rabobank is also not doing it by traditional financial means on a large scale yet. And to be able to also provide services to these smallholder farmers, we thought about Acorn and also the Rabo Carbon Bank. So Acorn is part of the Rabo Carbon Bank, and our aim is to connect smallholder farmers that make a transition to an agroforestry system, so basically planting trees on their land, to the international voluntary carbon market. Give you a brief example, I visited a project in Peru in June this year, whereby we work with Solidaridad, an NGO that already works with coffee farmers for quite some time to plant additional trees on their land. And these trees, for example, they can provide shades to the coffee crops. And to be honest, I didn't know how coffee was grown before I went to the project. It's weird for a drink that we consume every day. But the productivity of the coffee plants actually is way better on the long term if it's grown in a shade system rather than into direct sunlight. Trees can also have a lot of different side benefits, and it's really beneficial for smallholder farmers to transition to agroforestry. But I think if we're talking about like the blockers or the barriers for transitioning to regenerative agriculture or agroforestry here, finance is one thing. Obviously, working at a bank, so we have to talk about finance here. But the barriers are actually multifold. So it's about training. Farmers need to know which trees to plant, for example, how to properly maintain the trees. And if a farmer wants to invest in the transition, as Chris also mentioned, it's quite hard to access long-term credit. And as nature doesn't really suit our very short-term horizons, which you like as human and the financial sector as well. We need to have a way of financing the transition to agroforestry system. And we believe carbon markets can be a really powerful tool to do so. So at Acorn, Rabobank, we don't consider carbon credits, so to say, because there's a lot of criticism out there in the market as well, as a nice thing per se, but we really like its potential to finance the transition of smallholders to an agroforestry system. And yeah, that's where we've been focusing on the start. We focused on overcoming the barriers for smallholder farmers to participate on the voluntary carbon market, which is certification to begin with. It's very hard for project developers working with smallholders to get certification. It's costly, it's a lengthy process, and we have transformed it by working with the Plant Vivo Foundation in truly making the certification process more efficient for our local project developers. Then technology, super important for our proposition, is that we can, using remote sensing technology, so satellite images, if we have a polygon, which is basically the surroundings of a smallholder farmer's area, we can year on year measure the growth of the trees, the biomass, on the level of the individual smallholder plot, completely remotely. We need some data collection on the ground before we can do so. But because of these two cost reductions, so certification and technology, we've been able to significantly reduce the costs of starting carbon projects focusing on agroforestry with smallholders, by which if we sell the carbon credits, because that's something we do at Acorn as well, to Microsoft, for example, corporates that aim to offset their CO2 emissions, they can reduce themselves. We are able, because of these cost reductions, to channel 80% back to the farmers. And that's truly high if you look at other propositions in the market. And I truly believe that's the logical thing to do, both from an ethical perspective. The farmers and the communities are doing the most work to plant, but more importantly to maintain the trees, but also from a de-risking perspective, because if a farmer doesn't really have an incentive to maintain the trees, why on earth can we expect that the tree is maintained well? So basically, in a nutshell, that's what Acorn does.
In a nutshell, of course, an acorn is a kind of nutshell, so that's really perfect. All right, we're going to try and have a little bit of a deeper dive into this for this broadcast. I mean, what are the blockers to scaling regenerative agriculture? How do we tear those down, starting here in Sharm el-Sheikh and rapidly over the next few years? Because by 2030, the world's supposed to halve its emissions, right? To have a 50-50 chance of hitting net zero in 2050. I saw a presentation today from the Exponential Roadmap Initiative and Conservation International that suggested that a huge amount of those emission reductions to halve the global emissions around the world could come from regenerative agriculture and other nature-based solutions, because they can move very quickly if we move very quickly. So that's where we stand, and we've got Luis still on the magic of Zoom. That's fantastic. We've got Irene here, we've got Chris, and we've got Max. I'm going to hand over to Hanneke for your first question.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I think it'd be great to have a quick round. You guys touched on it, but what are the blockers to move faster on regenerative agriculture, either locally or across countries, either with smallholders or with big farmers? Is it money? Is it a good system to be able to sell those carbon credits? Is it other things? And maybe we start actually on Zoom in the Philippines. Go right ahead.
Absolutely. Thank you, Hanneke. Thinking about it, there's a lot of different factors and blockers that hinder regenerative agriculture or even transitioning to it. One of them can be, as you mentioned, incentivizing farmers. There's really no incentive for farmers to transition unless there's a way for them to do it via carbon credits, or really teaching them the practicality of it, because the language that we have surrounding regenerative agriculture is usually around environmentalism or, you know, the benefits to the planet. But what about in a practical scale that farmers can understand? How about whether it's making sure that their harvests last longer, or having harvests that are reliable, because we see that soil degradation is taking away from our ability to produce more harvests. In fact, the world has about 60 years worth of harvests left. On top of that, on a more higher end zooming out policy scale, right now, there is around $600 billion worth of agricultural subsidies that fund agriculture that is extractive. And we need and can transition most of that into transitioning into regenerative agriculture. And I think there's an opportunity there here to do that here at COP, or at least drumbeat it. And more importantly, I think another thing that we should also acknowledge is that many of the principles and ideas and technology that we need for regenerative agriculture already exists within Global South traditional and indigenous systems. It's a matter of bringing it back, because 50 or so years ago, food was just food and agriculture was just agriculture. My grandmother would be able to make a meal without thinking of its impact on the planet. But nowadays, it's inextricable to think that whether I have meat on my plate or dairy or eggs or cheese, it's just thinking about that is already a very stressful endeavor, because people don't realize where their food is coming from. So ideally, we would increase food literacy at the individual consumer level, but on top of that, find ways to tap into traditional knowledge systems and return to those systems, or at least merge them into modern science and know-how and understanding in a way that's practical as well for our producers to understand.
Food literacy to consumers. That was an interesting point, wasn't it? Anybody else like to jump in here? I mean, let's see. I mean, is it finance? Is it education? Is it policy by governments? Is it all, whatever?
I'll give you the finance. I'll give you the finance figures. It's estimated that we need 240 billion going to smallholder farmers, indigenous peoples groups, if we're to achieve the climate solutions, climate, food, and biodiversity solutions that we need to, the crisis that we need to challenge. But we actually, so that's a quarter of annual climate finance. But at the moment, we see 1.7% going to smallholders and less than 1% going to indigenous peoples groups. That's 2.5% of climate finance, and that to a group that provide, as we said, 80% of the food that is consumed globally. And that's just fundamentally wrong. We need to put in systems that is getting down to the ground and getting money to the ground, onto the ground, and building the capacity of farmer organizations to be able to mobilize that at scale is essential, and then we can mobilize that. And that's not just public finance, that's also private finance.
Yeah. Irene, why don't you come in here as well? Because you also mentioned getting a proper price for the food.
Yes. I think it's high time we need to price regenerative agriculture produced food just the same way organic foods are priced, so that the farmers really find the incentive to do what they are doing. The other thing which I think is a barrier is our mindsets. We are still, blocked to appreciate opportunities that exist in our eyes, and we are still, struggling to find new solutions every time when there are certain things that are working which we just need to project. Now, the Global Evergreening Alliance is working with about 1.5 million farmers to apply simple regenerative agriculture technique like FMNR. If we do not project some of these opportunities that are working so that people are able to appreciate and leverage on them, we will still imagine that it's so difficult and it's very challenging to start, and we get stuck there. I think also there's need for more simplified technologies empowered to farmers, because sometimes when it becomes very complex and complicated, they keep off.
Max, do you want to just quickly bump in on that? Because how many farmers are you working with, by the way, now, Max? How many farmers, and how long has Acorn been going?
We started in April 2020, and
Right.
since then we were now working with more than 30,000 farmers, which have been onboarded onto our platform.
And they're all small scale. Are there any medium scale?
Well, depends on your definition of a smallholder farmer. We work with smallholders that have a maximum size of their land of a maximum of 10 hectares of cultivated land. We have other propositions in the bank as well that focus on the larger scale farmers, which is obviously also very important. But in our case, it's the smallholders, because we think we can make most impact there in terms of the additional carbon income that can flow to the farmers, and the other impact indicators as well. And to respond to your question, I think, well, in Holland, we say if you ask a question, you already imply you already answered them. Like all the blockers that you mentioned, they are important. But if I can highlight one that especially applies to smallholder farmers, that is, as it's so called, the last mile delivery. So who's going to interact with all of these numerous smallholder farmers in the world. Like in our case, we work with NGOs such as the Global Evergreening Alliance, Solidaridad, One Acre Fund, that already work with the smallholder farmers, because us as a bank, we're never going to be the partner that work with such big numbers of smallholder farmers directly. But we've been really able to leverage the work that they do in terms of having the trust of the smallholder farmers, providing training to the farmers in terms of how to plant the trees, how to maintain them. And I guess it's super important, if we want to work with these smallholder farmers, is really to put them on the center of the design. So really focus on how can we ensure that all of the barriers that prevent them from regenerative agriculture have been taken away. So collaboration there is really key.
Yeah, I think the three of you are all saying the same thing. Farmers, smallholders organizing themselves in larger groups is really important to tap into the funding and to learn from each other. You know, one of our examples at Unilever, probably our most successful Regen Ag program is in the US, in Iowa, soybean farming. We use a lot of soybeans in mayonnaise. And we have a great partner there called the Practical Farmers of Iowa, which is an organization that basically every soybean farmer in Iowa is a member of. And they learn from each other. Without them, there's no way we could have had the success that we've had in terms of yields, which are up, water pollution, which is 30% down, soil health, which is up, and emissions, which are down. So you need those farmer alliances, and I'm glad you guys brought it up.
That's a very good point. So I think we have learned something there, absolutely. You knew it anyway, but I've just learned it, and hopefully the audience has now learned it. We need to build the capacity of farmers' organizations to have that scale that the money can get to and they get down to a lower level. I'm just going to, I don't want to, flog an old horse. I keep talking about finance, don't I? But I mean, Ivo Mulder, who's with the UN Environment Programme, I talked to him because they have a State of Nature report. They brought one out recently. They were going to bring one out just before COP27, but they've delayed it to bring it out just before the COP in Montreal. He said that the latest State of Nature Finance report will, in many ways, reflect that most of the money still at the moment into Regen Ag is actually coming from philanthropic sources and the carbon markets. And at the moment, it's still a bit trapped there. Now, their report will be looking backwards, of course, so it may have changed, etc. But Hanneke, I wanted to ask you this question, which is a tough question, really, because you're not just a moderator, you're also the president of nutrition, whatever, for Unilever. I mean, that's quite an important role. What is the finance role of a food company, a large food company like yours?
No, we have an important role to play. We realize that. So to that point at Unilever, we created a €1 billion climate and nature fund, which will mostly and is mostly go into regenerative agriculture. Different ways. Crop insurance for farmers, financing the transition, because Irene said it well, it takes a number of years. You don't just flip a switch. And various other ways to fund farmers. So that's our own fund. We also just announced another fund with AXA and Tikehau, which is a blended fund, again, to finance regenerative agriculture practices. We're hoping that governments, so we're doing advocacy with governments to repurpose some of the subsidies that you guys talked about that are actually harming the environment. I think that's what Louise was referring to. And if you guys have other creative ideas on how we can do more, we'd love to hear them. So definitely a big role for the Unilevers, the Nestle's, the PepsiCos in the financing of Regen Ag, and especially in the transition. Because we're also convinced that once you transition and you have 3, 4, 5 harvests done, your yields are actually up and you're in a better place, and you may not need that financing going forward.
I wanted just to come back on this issue of subsidies, because we know this world is full of subsidies of all shapes and kinds, and some of them, you can't be against some of them because they kickstart new ideas. Often, renewable energy was kickstarted in the beginning by subsidies, and now wind and solar are cheaper than coal and cheaper than actually other forms of fossil fuel energy in many parts of the world. So that's a really great story, although we can't wait as long as that, because it all started in the 1990s and it got to about 2020 before it really matured. But is subsidies on agriculture an issue here? Because this has been money, I know it's always been a standing issue between the North and the South with the European Union for many years, Irene, because you produce things in Africa, but the farmers in Europe have these subsidies, so it's hard to get your products in. But I was also interested, and maybe this is a crazy thing, but looking at that Financial Times article, it said that regenerative agriculture was growing in Latin America and North America, and now starting to grow a little bit in Africa, but not so much in Europe. And I wondered, is that because the subsidies in Europe are so massive that it works against any farmers thinking about doing anything different? Is there something in this, or am I just smoking something that I shouldn't be?
I can attempt. I think it's a little bit ironic. Irene and I worked in Africa for many years. You always used to hear this saying, well, the farmers need to stand on their own 2 feet. You know, they don't need project funding. Well, it was a little bit ironic coming from Europe, as the UK was previously, but on the Common Agricultural Policy, which is the most heavily subsidised industry probably going, and driving low-cost, high productivity systems. And I think you're right, Nick, that it is a challenge. But Hanneke, I think what you said is yes, there's changing the public finance, but it's also making sure that actually regenerative agriculture makes sense. And we did some work going up actually, how time flies, but going towards Glasgow last year about looking at how how regenerative agriculture actually makes business sense. You know, once you've gone through that transition, we saw projections of 40% increase in yields, the 30% reduction in soil erosion, and these also make long-term resilience to your systems. But I think also, and it was also the carbon benefits of 20% increase in carbon. So that's just business sense. But I think subsidies also need to reflect that, and reflect that it's a growth opportunity. And within that analysis, there is potential for 5 million of jobs. So when you're looking at ODA, I think that's overseas development funding. That's a great opportunity that we can also use as well. So it's not just about subsidies; it's all about all public finance.
I'm very conscious of Louise on Zoom, because it's easy to forget you, not because you're not wonderful, but because you're not physically in the room. Do you want to comment on that, Louise?
Oh, there we go. I think I was on mute. I don't have the ability to unmute myself. But yes, I think that agricultural subsidies have had incredible benefits if you think about it. The Philippines is obviously one of the countries that have benefited very much from agriculture. And many farmers in the global south require these in order to recover, even from just typhoons, or being able to stand and survive each harvest season, since we have the highest instances of storms. But there's also the consciousness of how these subsidies are being distributed and how it's being used in a practical way. So as the previous speaker mentioned, it's really important for us to actually look at the benefits of regenerative agriculture, show that to our governments and the policymakers who are in charge of distributing it, and showing that there are opportunities for regenerative agriculture to be practical for farmers. And think of it in a sense of how we can use these subsidies best in rural areas and local places, and educate more people about how to implement things in a practical way that's good for the environment. A lot of what we do at the Cacao Project is showing people that land stewardship is incredibly important, but also very closely tied with how our lives and our community systems work. These forests provide ecosystems of protection, windbreakers. They provide services, better air, and just better quality of life. And I think once you have those benefits stacked up against each other, the argument for investing more into sustainable agriculture and using these subsidies to transition is something that you just can't deny anymore.
I would just like to mention one small thing, which is there is a pot of gold out there for climate action from perhaps one area where subsidies have for many years been going in the wrong direction, and that of course are fossil fuel subsidies, which are also, by the way, behind keeping artificial nitrogen fertilizers a little bit lower than they should be because they come from fossil fuels. We don't have, they're the numbers, by the way, over there, which are based on the International Monetary Fund, which we started in COP26 last year, actually. And that's now where it stands. That's what governments have paid in terms of fossil fuel subsidies or damages from climate change, which are then subsidized in terms of trying to cope with those damages. And the number comes to 6 trillion, just over $6 trillion right now. And that's $11 million a minute. So when we talk about a billion here and a billion there, there is a pot of gold over here. I sound like an Irishman talking about the rainbow, don't I? And there's a pot of gold at the end with a leprechaun. But it actually is quite, they're real numbers. So we could maybe deploy some subsidies that are happening in the world more productively and also reduce climate change in the process. You can comment if you like, or you don't have to.
I will just very quickly comment. Nick, I think you raised a really interesting point, is because sometimes we say for regenerative agriculture, climate, we need new finance, but is it just not the channeling of better finance in a better direction? So I think your 6 trillion, I'm not sure if that, is that, did you say 6 trillion? Because it's right. There's so many zeros, it's a bit confusing, but it just goes to show if you put that money into regenerative agriculture, we'd really make some progress and send it to farmer organizations. You'd be happy, Irene.
In fact, sometimes we find what our governments are subsidizing are more, contrary to regenerative agriculture. So fertilizers are really being given to farmers at a rate at which they would not actually find the incentive to do regenerative agriculture. So the conflicting policies that do not even appreciate or support regenerative agriculture are a problem we are facing. So while we appreciate subsidies, which kind of subsidies are we talking about? I think there needs to be, if there are external support that is coming in, it needs to ensure that it counteracts what probably government is providing or certain organizations are providing that actually make farmers more dependent on these other options. And that's why I still say we must get to a point where we can tag regenerative agriculture produced products to be priced fairly so that they can actually compete with what is produced in the conventional or more, unsustainable ways.
Yeah, well said, well said. Max, did you have any last thoughts on that point on subsidies?
Well, I just find it very scary that this number is increasing even more. And what you just mentioned, whether the majority of the funding is still coming from philanthropic sources for regenerative agriculture, I always hear myself quoting that having public funding and philanthropic funding for the transition is not enough, but apparently there's a lot of public finance out there, and I agree with your point, Chris. If we just channel that finance into the right directions, which is tricky, we need to talk not only with the government probably, but also with the lobbyers and the entire sector, but then we can get there as well.
Well, I'm hopeful after this COP that hopefully we've done a little bit of impressing on all the governments that were here, that regenerative agriculture is worth spending money on. And some very big governments, the US most notably, are doing it recently, so that's great. So that's my hope from COP. To wrap up, what would be great, can we just hear one thing that you hope will come out of this COP now that you've been here for a number of days? Really, 30 seconds. One thing you hope for. We'll go around, and Louise, we're going to end with you this time because it's not fair that we keep asking you to go first. So Max, one thing from you.
Great. Well, talking about action, Acorn, we really focus on tangible projects on the ground. So I talked to a lot of foundations as well during this COP. I really hope we can work together with them to boost finance into these smallholder farmers and enable them to transition to agroforestry.
Smallholders have the will and the power to make a difference in their lives. Let us invest at the grassroots and ensure that farmers are empowered to transform this world to the better place we want to be.
Thanks. I'd like to see the ocean instead of a conference centre. That would be the first thing. But my second wish is start talking about transforming our systems, not just greening what we're talking about, what we're doing now, but actually transforming our system. And we just heard that from my other panelists of how we want to move, not just from greening monoculture systems, but actually changing that has people at the center, people and culture.
And Louise, Hanneke
Yeah,
gave you the last word on this.
Oh, what a big responsibility. But I'm just going to echo what everyone said. I think my wish is that food systems becomes a critical part of the agenda for climate. After all, it's 30% of the solution to climate solutions, and that landscape stewardship becomes a really critical part or pivotal part of the solutions that we're going to be proposing with farmers, especially in the global south at the center, since they are 80% of the people who produce our food.
Well, there we go. Episode 2 of ReAgriculture, food and farming on a healthy planet. It has been an amazing COP. It has been an amazing time to actually see this agenda really going and bubbling up to the surface. And I think we did learn a little bit that Irene has an idea, something that's not too heavy, but a little tag that says this was done by a regenerative agricultural farming system. At least people know something's happening, and it might get people talking about it. Oh, it tasted quite good. And what is that regenerative agriculture? That might be the way of spreading it. Who knows?
Especially if it's cooked by Louise.
Especially if it's cooked by Louise, right? So next time, Louise, you have to come wherever we all are, and we expect a 3-course meal on that. So maybe we haven't found the full answer to how we communicate regenerative agriculture to consumers, but we have some ideas. And I think we've heard about some of the blockers for sure. I also want to just remind the viewers that there will be an episode 3 of this, episode 3, the last episode in this mini-series on ReAgriculture, food and farming on a healthy planet, brought to you by We Don't Have Time and supported by Unilever, which will be broadcast in early December. Any last thought, Hanneke?
No, I leave COP hopeful. So let's take that hope to episode 3.
Super. Bye-bye, everybody out there. Thanks for watching.